The rent room at Ashcombe Park smelled of beeswax and old paper, and every chair in it was full. Cassandra Wren stood at the back of the room with the ledger pressed flat against her chest, because her hands would not stop their small tremor otherwise, and she had learned long ago that stillness could be manufactured, even when calm could not. The tenants sat in their good coats. The steward's clerk shuffled receipts at the long table, and the Earl of Ashcombe stood at the head of it in a dark coat, with his jaw set like something carved and left out in weather, looking down at a column of figures that did not agree with the figures Cassandra had copied out herself, 3 years running, in her father's careful hand, and then in her own. Someone near the fire murmured the phrase that had followed her since she was 19. The embezzler's daughter. She did not turn. She had trained herself not to turn. What she did not yet know, standing there with the ledger warm against her collarbone, was that the man at the head of the table had spent the whole of the previous night with that same ledger open across his knees, and had not slept, and had looked up more than once toward the door, as though he half expected her to walk through it and settle a question he had not yet found the courage to ask aloud. He looked at her now. Not long. A single measuring glance across the room, the kind a man gives a fact he is not ready to name. Then he looked back down at the figures and said nothing, and the room exhaled around her as though she had already been dismissed from its notice. She had come to Ashcombe Park 3 mornings a week for 2 years, ever since the rector's wife had recommended her hand for the parish accounts, and later for the estate's overflow of correspondence. She copied letters. She squared columns the steward's clerk was too proud to admit he could not square himself. She was paid in shillings, and in the particular, exhausting invisibility of a woman whose father's name had been ruined before she was old enough to defend it. Her father had been steward here. Samuel Wren, dead 6 years now, had managed the Ashcombe accounts for the 4th Earl with a devotion that verged on reverence. And when the discrepancy was found, when £1,100 could not be accounted for in the harvest year before his death, the old Earl's solicitor had needed only a fortnight to decide whose name would carry the blame. Her father had not lived to defend himself. He had died of a fever that winter with the accusation still hanging over him, unproven and unwithdrawn, and the family had been given 6 weeks to vacate the cottage that had been theirs, by every account Cassandra had ever heard whispered in the kitchen, since before her grandfather's time. Cassandra remembered the cottage from her childhood better than she sometimes trusted herself to admit. The low-beamed kitchen, the apple tree that had dropped fruit onto the roof every September with a sound like small footsteps, her father's boots by the door in every weather. Thorn Cottage stood empty still at the edge of the home wood, its garden gone to bramble. Cassandra's mother lodged now above the chandler's shop in the village, in 2 rooms that smelled permanently of tallow. And Cassandra walked past the cottage twice a week on her way to the great house, and never once let herself stop at the gate. The current Earl, Julian Vane, had inherited the title only 14 months ago, upon his father's sudden death, and had inherited with it a household still murmuring her father's disgrace as settled fact. He had said perhaps 40 words to Cassandra in the whole of that time. Good morning. Thank you. That will be all. He was, by every account the village gave him, a cold sort of man, correct in his dealings and sparing with his warmth, the kind of earl who inspected his own account books rather than trusting them to anyone, which was precisely why Cassandra now stood in the rent-room with her heart beating hard enough to be felt at her throat, because the figures did not agree. She had noticed it herself, 6 months past, copying the harvest ledger for the year of her father's disgrace, and had said nothing, because who would have believed the steward's daughter over the entry an earl's own father had signed? The meeting broke up around her in the ordinary shuffle of chairs and low talk, The Dowager Countess, seated near the window in dove gray with her hands folded like a woman awaiting a verdict she already knew, rose and crossed to her son's side and said something too low for the room to hear. Cassandra did not need to hear it. She had heard some version of it before, in the corridor outside the Earl's study, on an afternoon when the Dowager had not troubled to lower her voice for a copyist's sake. The embezzler's daughter has no business handling the accounts her father corrupted. That had been the first time. It would not, though Cassandra could not have known it yet, be the last. She gathered her things. She did not look toward the fire, where the murmuring matron still sat with her needlework, and she did not look toward the Earl, who was watching her go, with an attention he had no practical reason to spend on a copyist gathering her shawl. And she walked out into the cold October afternoon with the ledger's wrongness sitting in her chest like a swallowed stone. If you have ever carried a truth you were certain no one would credit, you will know the particular weight of it, the way it changes how a person walks through a room. Stay a while. This is a story about what happens when someone finally does credit it. She was halfway down the drive, past the yew hedge and the cold stone lions that had flanked the gate since before her birth, when she heard footsteps behind her on the gravel, quick and deliberate, and turned to find the Earl of Ashcombe himself, closing the distance with his coat still unbuttoned against the wind. He stopped 2 paces from her, which was 1 pace nearer than propriety strictly allowed, and for a moment he said nothing at all. His eyes were a gray that shifted with the light, and just now, in the flat October afternoon, they were the color of a river before ice. "Wait," he said. "There is a matter in the harvest ledger. The 1811 ledger. I believe you have seen it." It was not a question. Cassandra felt the stone in her chest turn over. "I have seen a great many ledgers, my lord," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "You have seen this one twice," he said. "Once as a girl of 16, copying for your father, and once this spring, copying for me." He paused. "I would like to know what you saw the second time, that you did not report." The wind moved through the yews. Somewhere behind them, in the house she had just left, the Dowager's voice carried faintly through an open window, sharp with some complaint Cassandra could not make out. "I saw an error," Cassandra said carefully. "I did not think it my place to name it." He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his composure that she could not yet read, something that was not quite anger, and not quite grief. "It is precisely your place," he said. "I am asking you to name it now." She did not. Not that afternoon. She told him only that certain entries wanted checking against the original receipts, which was true, and revealed nothing he could not have found himself. And he accepted it with a short nod that told her he had expected exactly this much and no more. He did not offer her his arm for the remainder of the drive, though he walked beside her to the gate in a silence that felt, absurdly, like a kind of company she had not had in years. "Sit a moment," he said at the gate, nodding toward the low wall where the lion stood watch. "You have gone pale." "I am quite well, my lord." "Sit regardless," he said. And there was nothing in it she could call unkind, only the flat certainty of a man accustomed to being obeyed. And beneath that, something gentler he did not seem to know how to say plainly. She sat. He did not sit beside her, but he did not leave either, and stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking down the long avenue of bare trees, as though the answer to something might be found among them. "Your father was a good steward," he said abruptly. "I have read enough of his hand this past fortnight to know that much for certain." Cassandra's throat closed around a reply she had not permitted herself in 6 years, and she said nothing at all. And the Earl, watching her face rather than the avenue now, seemed to understand that some things could not yet be spoken aloud between them, and let the silence stand. The days that followed settled into a strange new rhythm. Cassandra still came 3 mornings a week, and the Earl still greeted her with the same clipped good morning he gave the steward's clerk and the housekeeper alike. But she had begun to notice the small ways his attention snagged on her without his permission. He asked, twice, whether she had eaten before walking the 2 miles from the village. He corrected the under-footman sharply when the boy nearly closed a door on her skirts, more sharply than the offense seemed to warrant. Once, passing her in the long gallery with an armful of correspondence, he stopped, turned back, and asked whether her mother's rooms above the chandler's shop were warm enough for the coming winter, a question so unlike him that Cassandra stood holding her breath in the empty gallery for a full minute after he had gone. She told herself it was ordinary courtesy, extended to any servant of long standing. She told herself this several times, and believed it slightly less on each telling. The 1811 ledger occupied him increasingly. Cassandra saw the evidence of it in small things: ink-stained fingers at breakfast hour, a candle burned to its last inch in the study grate, a stack of old receipts moved from the muniment room to his desk and left there, growing, week upon week. He did not ask her about it again directly. He watched her instead, when he thought her occupied with her copying. And she felt the weight of that watching, the way one feels weather changing, before the sky itself has clouded. It was in the 2nd week of November that the witnessing happened, though Cassandra did not know at the time that it was being witnessed at all. She had gone down to the kitchen passage to return a tray and found the hallboy, a thin child of perhaps 10 named Toby, backed against the pantry shelves while the housekeeper stood over him with a face like a slammed door, demanding to know who had broken the good blue jug from the dresser. Toby's chin trembled. He had not broken it. Cassandra had seen the kitchen cat knock it from the shelf herself, not an hour before, while she waited for the tray to be readied, and had said nothing at the time because it had seemed a small matter beneath her notice. It did not seem small now, watching the housekeeper reach for the boy's ear. "It was not Toby," Cassandra said, stepping into the passage before she had entirely decided to. "It was the cat. I saw it happen. I ought to have said so at once, and I did not, and I am sorry for it. But the fault is mine for my silence, and not his for anything at all." The housekeeper's face went through several expressions in quick succession, none of them pleased. But a hallboy's word could not stand against a copyist's, and a copyist's could not entirely stand against a housekeeper's authority in her own kitchen, and for a moment the outcome hung uncertain. It was resolved only when a voice from the passage doorway, unhurried and entirely without heat, observed that a broken jug seemed a poor use of the household's morning, and that Toby might return to his duties. Cassandra had not heard the Earl arrive. She did not know how long he had stood in the doorway, nor how much of it he had seen, until later that same afternoon, when he found her copying letters alone in the estate office and set down beside her elbow, without comment, a small dish of the ginger biscuits the cook kept for the nursery. "You did not have to intervene," he said. "It was not your affair." "It was entirely my affair," Cassandra said. "I watched it happen and said nothing. That is a kind of guilt of its own." He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again his voice had a different register to it, something lower and less guarded than she had yet heard from him. "I have known a great many people," he said, "who would have let the boy take the blame and thought nothing further of it. My father among them, I begin to fear." He did not explain himself further, and Cassandra did not ask, though the sentence sat between them for the rest of the afternoon, like a door left a few inches open. The gossip found her 3 days later at the chandler's shop, where she had gone to fetch tallow for her mother, and found Mrs. Kettridge, the miller's wife, already installed at the counter with her basket and her opinions. "Well," said Mrs. Kettridge to the shopkeeper's wife, loud enough to carry to every corner of the little shop, "I hear the embezzler's daughter has made herself quite at home up at the great house these days. Ledgers by day, and who knows what by night. His lordship wants a firmer hand with his household, if you ask me, though nobody has asked." Cassandra paid for the tallow with hands that did not shake, because 6 years of practice had taught her that much at least, and walked the whole way home with her chin level and her eyes fixed on the road. And only once she had climbed the narrow stair to her mother's rooms did she permit herself to sit down hard upon the bed and press both hands flat against her skirts until the shaking passed. Her mother, folding linen by the window, did not look up. "You must not mind them, Cassandra. They minded your father too once, before they decided to forget how much they had owed him." "I do not mind them," Cassandra said, which was not entirely true, and both of them knew it, and neither said so aloud. That evening, after her mother had gone to bed, Cassandra took down the small tin dispatch box that had been her father's, kept now beneath a loose floorboard because their rooms above the chandler's shop offered no better place for keeping. Inside it lay the ordinary residue of a steward's life, a broken watch chain, a few unpaid receipts he had meant to settle, and, folded small and soft with handling, a letter in a hand 2 generations older than her own. It was written by the 3rd Earl of Ashcombe, Julian's grandfather, in the year Cassandra's grandfather had pulled the old Earl's youngest son from the mill pond at the risk of his own life, and it granted to the Wren family, in gratitude and in perpetuity, the tenancy of the cottage known as Thorn Cottage, at a peppercorn rent, for so long as a Wren should wish to keep it. Her father had shown it to her only once, the year before he died, and told her to keep it always, though at the time neither of them had understood that it would one day be all that stood between the family and homelessness. Cassandra read it now by candlelight, as she had read it 100 times before, and put it back beneath the floorboard, and did not yet know how soon she would need it. If you have ever been named for a fault that was never yours to carry, you will know how long such a name can follow a person, and how little proof it asks for before it settles. We are close now to the hour when Cassandra's story turns. Stay with it a while longer. She did not go to the great house the following week, kept home by her mother's cough and the first hard frost, and it was in that week that Julian Vane found what he had been searching for since October. He had gone back through every receipt in the muniment room, every letter his father had written in the last year of Samuel Wren's service, and on a Tuesday evening, alone in the study with the fire burned down to embers, he found the second ledger. It had been pressed flat inside the false bottom of an old dispatch box that had belonged to his grandfather, and it recorded, in his father's own unmistakable hand, a set of debts to a moneylender in Bath that no steward's accounting had ever been permitted to see. £1,100, borrowed against the harvest and never repaid, entered nowhere in the estate's true books, and covered instead by a single instruction, dated the autumn before Samuel Wren's death, directing the steward to adjust the harvest figures to absorb the shortfall or answer for it himself. Julian had known his father as a hard man, but not, he had believed until that Tuesday, a dishonest one. He had spent 14 months since his father's death trying to run the estate to a standard of correctness he had assumed his father shared, and had wondered, more than once and never aloud, why the effort felt so much like penance. Now he understood. His father had not merely failed to protect Samuel Wren from an accusation. His father had manufactured it, deliberately, to save himself, and had let a good man die disgraced rather than confess a gambling debt to his own solicitor. Julian sat a long while with the false-bottomed box open on his knees and the fire dying in the grate, and what moved through him was not quite grief and not quite fury, but some third thing that had no easy name. The the particular sickness of discovering that the man whose good opinion he had spent his whole life chasing had been capable, in the end, of sacrificing an innocent man to keep his own ledgers tidy. He had built his coldness, these 14 months, on the belief that he was merely continuing his father's discipline. He saw now that he had been guarding a lie and calling it inheritance. He thought of Cassandra standing in the rent room with the ledger pressed to her chest, saying, "I did not think it my place to name it," and he understood, with a shame that sat behind his ribs like a stone swallowed whole, exactly what she had been protecting him from having to hear. If this came out, and it would come out the moment he did what honor required of him, it would not stay contained to an old steward's name. It would touch the Ashcombe title itself, at the precise season when his mother had spent a year arranging his introduction to Lady Eleanor Fairfax, whose father would not tie his daughter's fortune to a family under a cloud of fraud, however old. It would touch every tenant who trusted the Ashcombe name on a lease. It would touch his mother, who had spent 30 years believing herself married to a scrupulous man. He did not decide that night what he would do, only that he could not undo what he now knew. He put the ledger away in his own desk, beneath the lock only he possessed the key to, and he did not sleep again before dawn. He rose twice in the darkness and stood at the window looking down over the frost-whitened park, as though the answer might be found somewhere among the bare trees, and both times returned to bed no nearer to it. Cassandra returned to Ashcombe Park on the Thursday. Her mother's cough improved. To find the Earl changed in some way she could not at first name. He was quieter. He watched her more openly now, without troubling to disguise it. And twice that morning she caught him beginning a sentence and abandoning it before it reached its end. It was not until the afternoon, in the estate office with the door closed against the household's ordinary traffic, that he told her what the second ledger contained. He did not soften it. He gave her the figures plainly, the dates, the moneylender's name, the instruction in his father's hand, and watched her face, while he did it as though bracing for a blow he had decided he deserved to receive. "Your father did not embezzle a shilling," he said. "My father did. And let yours carry the accusation into his grave rather than confess it himself. I am sorry. It is a wretched, insufficient word, and I have no better one." Cassandra sat very still, the way she had learned to sit still through 6 years of small daily insults. But this stillness was of a different order entirely. The stillness of a woman hearing, at last, the thing she had known in her bones, and had never once been permitted to say aloud. When she finally spoke, her voice was not quite steady. "I have known it," she said. "Not the particulars, yet I have known it the way one knows the shape of a room in the dark, by moving through it long enough in silence. Thank you for the particulars." Julian looked at her for a long moment, and something in his composure, so carefully maintained through 14 months of correctness, seemed to loosen slightly at the edges. "Sit there a moment longer," he said, low. "You have had a great deal handed to you at once, and I find I am in no hurry to send you back out into the cold." She sat. He did not leave her, though propriety would have excused him a dozen times over, and the fire burned low in the estate office grate, while outside the first true snow of the season began, quietly, to fall. The Dowager Countess learned of her son's discovery within a week, as such things are learned in a great house, through a maid who had glimpsed the false-bottomed box, and a butler who had overheard more than he was meant to. She came to Julian's study on a gray Sunday afternoon in early December, closed the door behind her with a care that told him this would not be a short conversation, and did not sit. "You mean to ruin us," she said, not in temper. in the flat, practiced tone of a woman who had spent 30 years believing composure to be a kind of armor. "I mean to tell the truth," Julian said. "There is a difference, madam, though I understand you may not credit it just now." "The truth," she said, "will reach Sir Roland Fairfax's ears within a fortnight of your telling it, and Eleanor's family will not tie their daughter to a house under a cloud of fraud, however old the fraud, and however innocent the son. You will lose the match. You may lose more than the match. And for what? For a dead steward's reputation, and for a copyist you have taken an interest in that this household has already begun to remark upon." Julian said nothing to that last, which told his mother more than any answer could have. She left him with the matter unresolved between them, but not before Cassandra herself heard, second-hand, exactly how far the dowager had carried her fear. It was the housekeeper who told her, not unkindly, catching her in the passage the following morning, with a face that suggested she took no pleasure in the errand. Her ladyship was heard to say, in the blue drawing-room, that the embezzler's daughter must be settled and sent off before Sir Roland's people caught wind of a whisper. Those were her words, Miss Wren. I thought you ought to hear it from me, and not from the kitchen. Cassandra thanked her and walked the rest of the corridor with her spine very straight, and it was that same afternoon that Julian summoned her to the estate office, and, standing at some distance from her, with his hands clasped behind his back in the posture she had come to know as his defense against his own feeling, made her an offer. "I have given this a great deal of thought," he said, "and I want to do right, by you and by your father's memory. But I cannot do it in a manner that touches my mother, or the Fairfax match, or the tenants who trust the Ashcombe name. I propose a settlement. £2,000, paid quietly, with my personal assurance that your father's innocence is known to me and always shall be. In exchange, I ask that the matter of the ledger remain between us, that it go no further than this room." Cassandra stood very still, the particular stillness she reserved for the moments that cost her the most to survive. "You are offering me gold," she said slowly, to hold my tongue. "I am offering you restitution," he said, though even as he said it, she watched something falter in his face, as though he heard, a beat too late, how the word restitution curdled into something meaner the instant it was tied to silence. "My father died disgraced in the sight of every soul in this village," she said. "My mother has spent 6 years above a chandler's shop, believing herself the widow of a thief. I have been called the embezzler's daughter in the street, in the shop, in this very house, by people who will go on calling me so long after your gold has bought my silence. Because gold does not correct a single word anyone has ever said about us. It only pays me to let them keep saying it, heap. Then tell me what you want instead," he said. And there was something raw now beneath the composure, something that had been waiting 14 months to break through it. "I want Thorn Cottage," Cassandra said. "Not as a gift, as what it already is. My father's steward's contract and your grandfather's own hand granted it to my family in perpetuity, for a debt your house owed mine long before either of us was born. I want it restored, in the record, in front of whoever must witness it, so that no one in Hollowmere can call it charity, and no one can take it from my mother again. I do not want your silence bought with your money. I want the truth spoken where it was first denied." Julian looked at her for a long moment, and whatever had been holding his composure in place for 14 months seemed, in that silence, to finally give way. "I have been my father's son in more ways than I knew," he said quietly. "I am sorry it took you saying it plainly for me to see the shape of my own cowardice." He did not touch her, though the distance between them had narrowed, without either of them quite choosing it. And Cassandra left the estate office that evening with the tin box's letter folded once more against her heart, and no certainty at all of what would come next. Julian called the tenants back to the rent room 8 days later, on a morning when frost lay thick and white across the yew hedge, and the stone lions wore small caps of it on their carved heads. Word had gone round the village that his lordship had a matter to settle before Christmastide, and the room filled faster than it had for the ordinary rent day. Every chair taken, the dowager seated near the window, in her customary dove gray with her hands folded and her face composed into something that did not quite manage to be calm. Cassandra stood at the back again, as she had stood in October, the tin box's letter carried now not against her chest, but in her own gloved hand, ready should it be needed. She had not expected Julian to send for her an hour before the meeting, nor to find him waiting for her alone in the estate office with the second ledger already laid open upon the desk. "I wanted you to have a moment before the room does," he said. "Whatever comes next, I did not want you to hear it first among strangers." He did not step closer, and neither did she. But the distance between them in the small office felt charged in a way that had nothing to do with the cold coming through the window glass. Cassandra was aware of her own heartbeat in a manner she rarely permitted herself to notice, aware of the particular quiet of his attention resting on her face and staying there. "I have wanted these past weeks," he said, low, "to say something I have no right yet to say, given all that stands unsettled between our two houses. I find I cannot entirely hold my tongue on it regardless. I have come to want your good opinion more than I have wanted anything in 14 months of trying to be worthy of a title I inherited under false pretenses." Cassandra did not step back from him, though every rule she had been raised inside told her she ought. "That is not nothing, my lord, to hear from a man who has spent a fortnight learning what his own father was capable of. It is not nothing to me either," he said, and for a moment his hand lifted, as though he might reach for hers, and stopped short of it, hovering a bare inch above her glove before he drew it back with visible effort. "Not yet," he said, more to himself than to her. "There is a room full of witnesses waiting, and you deserve to have this settled properly before I ask you for anything at all." They walked to the rent room together, though not arm in arm, and the room's low talk quieted as Julian took his place at the head of the long table and did not sit. "I called you here," he said, "to correct a wrong this house has carried for 6 years. In the year before his death, Samuel Wren, our late steward, was accused of taking £1,100 from the harvest accounts. That accusation was false. The debt was my father's own, borrowed against the harvest to cover a gambling debt in Bath, and concealed by an instruction in his own hand that I have here, and that any tenant present is welcome to examine." A murmur moved through the room like wind through standing corn. The dowager's hands, folded in her lap, went very still. "Samuel Wren died an innocent man," Julian said, "and this house owes his family a debt of honor it has been 6 years in the paying." He turned then, and found Cassandra's eyes across the room, and something in his voice changed, dropped lower, steadied itself for what came next. "I offered Miss Wren gold," he said, "to keep this matter quiet. She refused it, and asked instead for what was hers by right. Thorn Cottage returns to the Wren family today, by right." The room's silence held a beat. 2, 3. The particular silence of a crowd recalculating everything it had believed settled. Mrs. Kettridge, seated near the fire with her basket still on her knee, looked down at her hands as though the floor had shifted beneath her chair. The dowager's composure, so carefully maintained through 30 years and 14 months both, cracked at last into something smaller and more human. A woman who had spent a great deal of energy protecting a name that had never deserved the protecting she had given it. "I have been wrong," the dowager said, so quietly that only those nearest the window caught it at all, and did not finish the sentence, and did not need to. Cassandra stepped forward then, the tin box's letter still folded in her glove, and though she had thought she might need it to prove her claim, she found the room required no further proof than the Earl's own word, given publicly, in the same arena where her father's disgrace had first been rendered as settled fact. She set the letter on the table anyway, because some things wanted showing even when they were no longer strictly needed, and Julian looked down at his grandfather's hand upon the page, and then up at her, and the room, watching them both, understood exactly what it was witnessing. Thorn Cottage stood empty no longer by the time the first proper snow of the season settled over Hollowmere. Julian sent his own men to clear the bramble from the garden and mend the roof before Christmas, and refused, when Cassandra's mother tried to thank him for it, to hear a word of gratitude that framed it as anything other than a debt finally paid. The old blue door was repainted. The hearth, cold for 6 years, was swept and laid with a fire that took the whole of an afternoon to properly warm the rooms through, and Cassandra's mother stood in the middle of her old kitchen, with her hand pressed to her mouth, and did not trust herself to speak for a long while. The tin dispatch box came to rest on the mantel, where it had likely stood in her grandfather's day, and the letter from the third Earl was returned to it, no longer folded soft with the fear of needing it again, but kept now the way a family keeps a thing it no longer has to hide. Cassandra's mother polished the little box on Sunday evenings from habit alone, though there was nothing left in it that wanted protecting, and Cassandra came to understand that the polishing itself was a kind of prayer of thanks that her mother had no other way of speaking aloud. Julian came to Thorn Cottage himself, on the day the family took proper possession. A plain visit, unannounced. Standing at the garden gate in the fading afternoon light, with snow catching in his dark hair, and no ceremony about him at all. Cassandra came out to meet him, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, content to stand in the cold with the smoke rising thin and steady from the chimney behind her. "I believe I owe you the rest of what I did not say in the estate office," he said at last. "You do not owe me anything further, my lord. The debt is settled." "The debt is settled," he agreed. "What I feel for you is not a debt, and I find I no longer wish to leave it unspoken simply because it is inconvenient to the calendar of my mother's ambitions. I want you, Cassandra Wren, not as restitution, not as a settlement of any kind. I have wanted you since the afternoon in the rent room, when you stood at the back of a crowded room, and I could not, for the life of me, look anywhere else." Cassandra felt the words land somewhere beneath her ribs, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire behind her, and everything to do with the particular steadiness in his voice, the voice of a man who had spent 14 months learning the difference between his father's discipline and his own honesty, and had finally, she understood, chosen the harder of the two. "I have wanted the same," she said quietly, "for longer than I have permitted myself to admit, even to my own mother." He reached for her hand then, and did not stop short of it this time, his gloved fingers closing over hers at the garden gate with a gentleness that felt, after everything, like the truest thing either of them had said all winter. He did not kiss her there. Not yet. Some old instinct in them both understanding that the moment wanted patience rather than haste. But he drew her hand up and pressed his mouth briefly to her knuckles, and Cassandra felt the warmth of that single touch travel the whole length of her arm and settle, astonished, somewhere near her heart. "Will you permit me to call again?" he said properly, "with your mother's leave, and without a ledger between us this time." "You may call whenever you wish," Cassandra said, and found, for the first time in 6 years, that she did not have to guard the smile that answered him. He came again on Christmas Eve, and on a dozen evenings after, and by the time the snow finally cleared from the lane between Ashcombe Park and Thorn Cottage, the whole of Hollowmere had stopped calling her the embezzler's daughter and started instead to speak her name the way it should always have been spoken, plainly, without the old weight attached to it. Mrs. Kettridge, to her credit, was heard more than once to remark that she had always thought Miss Wren a steady, sensible girl, and no one in the shop troubled to remind her otherwise. On the evening the Earl finally asked her, properly, at the same garden gate where he had first pressed his mouth to her hand. Cassandra said yes, with the fire behind her, and her mother watching from the mended window, and the tin box catching the last of the firelight on the mantel, the old letter inside it resting now beside a new one, folded just as carefully, that promised her a home that no one would ever again have cause to take away. Thank you for staying with Cassandra's story until its end. If the quiet courage of a woman who asked for the truth instead of gold moved you, I hope you will carry a little of Thorn Cottage's warmth with you into your own evening.